Hey there. Tonight we begin with a very small object that should not feel dangerous, and yet somehow it does. In a quiet museum vault, under controlled air and careful light, there rests a clay tablet no larger than a human palm, reddish brown, dry, unassuming, the sort of thing you could miss if your eyes were tired. But when its lines are read closely, it does not sound like a routine inventory. It sounds like someone was moving sacred things quickly, sealing knowledge for departure, and preparing to leave before something larger arrived. If you enjoy these slow investigations into ancient mysteries, gently like the video and subscribe. Now let the room dim a little more. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the day recede, and let us begin where the archive begins, with clay, with dust, and with one very old note that may have survived because it was never meant to be forgotten. The story does not open in a temple ruin or under storm clouds. It opens in silence. Museum silence. The sort of hush that feels heavier than ordinary quiet because it is full of preserved things. Shelves, boxes, labels, histories packed into darkness and low light. I have always found it strange that some of the most unsettling moments in human history survive not as grand monuments, but as storage items. A shard, a broken seal, a tablet with a catalog number, and this one, known in modern archive language as CBS 10673, carries itself with exactly that humble confidence. It does not look dramatic. It does not need to. Imagine it resting on a tray, a gloved hand lifting it carefully, the clay warm only from the room, not from any living touch. The wedge marks pressed into its surface more than 4,000 years ago still hold their neat little geometry. Those marks were made while the tablet was wet, soft, fresh from the hand of a scribe who likely believed he was preserving procedure, not mystery. That matters. Administrative texts are often more revealing than myths, because myths know they are being remembered. Records think they are only doing their job. At first glance, the tablet looks like what scholars would expect from an old temple economy. Lists, transfers, sacred items accounted for with procedural precision. Not sold, not celebrated, not buried in ceremony. Moved, shifted from one precinct to another. Ritual implements, valuable objects, essential tablets. Then a detail that changes the room. The language suggests not ordinary temple management, but deliberate departure. Not future use in the same place. Not seasonal storage. Departure. Something is being made ready to leave. And the unease sharpens because of the way the script frames that departure. The word that later readers point to is a word that can mean to go away, to send away, to depart. In another context, it might feel harmless enough. But here, the source argues, it appears beside a marker usually associated with divine subjects. The gods are leaving. Or at least, that is the unsettling reading. The source wants us to sit beside, not returning triumphantly, not descending majestically, leaving. If you were standing here with me in that quiet vault, you might feel the shift in your own body at that moment. A tablet that a minute ago seemed administrative now feels almost like a last-minute note pinned to a door before a household vanished. And I think that is why this script begins so effectively. It does not ask us to accept a wild theory first. It asks us to look at the tone of the record. Routine, yes. But routine under pressure. The difference between a list written for storage and a list written because there is no time left to be careless. The source insists this tablet is not alone. That is the next turn. One text can be misread. One damaged line can be stretched too far. But dozens of records from scattered collections, Philadelphia, London, Oxford, Baghdad, Berlin, begin to look stranger when placed side by side. Read one by one. They resemble ordinary temple accounting. Read together. The argument goes. They begin to resemble evacuation paperwork. Sacred objects catalogued. Essential instructions preserved. Items transferred with care. Knowledge protected. Then absence. This is where the old familiar flood story begins to change shape. Most people know the simpler version. Humanity grows noisy. The gods grow tired. A flood comes. One family survives. Civilization begins again. Clean, severe, morally simple. But the source transcript does not want that clean version. It wants something colder and perhaps more disturbing. It wants the listener to consider the possibility that the flood was not the first act of the drama, but the last one. Not the cause, but the symptom. Not a divine tantrum, but the final visible sign of a longer breakdown that even the gods could not contain. And that shift matters because it changes the emotional weight of every tablet that follows. If the Anunnaki were not all powerful authors of disaster, but administrators confronting something beyond their capacity to manage, then these records stop sounding like proclamations and begin sounding like triage. Calm, formal, precise, but quietly afraid. Beings of enormous authority, discovering that authority has edges. Honestly, that is the part I find most haunting. Not the idea of gods leaving, but the idea of gods leaving carefully. Not chaos first, but procedure first. Lists, transfers, preserved instruction, sealed departure. It feels less like mythology and more like the mood inside an institution that has finally accepted that the building cannot be saved. The source lingers there, and it is wise to do so. Because once that image settles into the mind, one small clay tablet becomes difficult to shake. A scribe seated somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, maybe in a temple office, maybe under dim oil light, maybe listening to ordinary household sounds outside the wall, pressing one wedge after another into wet clay, recording what must go, what must be protected, what cannot be left to chance. He may not have known the whole reason. Scribes often do not. They are the hands of systems larger than themselves. But he knew enough to record the sequence properly. Sacred items, ritual instruments, essential instruction, transfer, seal, departure. Now let the camera of the mind pull back a little. Before we can ask what these beings were escaping, we have to understand who the source says they were in the first place. Not the modern internet versions. Not silver-skinned invaders descending from spacecraft. The text is careful here, and that care is important. It insists on reading the Anunnaki from inside Sumerian tradition itself, from the way the old world described them in its own language. That shift from modern fantasy back to ancient vocabulary is one of the source's strongest moves, because it replaces spectacle with structure. The Anunnaki, in this reading, are not random gods wandering through myth. They are a governing body, a council, a hierarchy, a distributed administration of divine power tied to cities, temples, domains, and decrees. They are those of heavenly descent who are on earth, or something close to that broad idea. That wording alone already carries a kind of distance. Origin elsewhere. Activity here. Presence on earth, but not native to it in the most immediate sense. And once the source starts describing their structure, the whole world of Sumer begins to feel less like mythology in the modern sense, and more like sacred bureaucracy. At the top, high authority. Beneath that, executive gods. Beneath them, a wider body administering specific domains, cities, functions, and forces. Fate itself is treated not as poetic mood, but almost as managed assignment. Decreed, distributed, maintained. The temples are not merely places of prayer in this framework. They are divine households, administrative centers, economic hubs, residences of local sacred authority. The god is not just honored there. The god is understood to live there, or to govern there, through systems sustained by priests, scribes, workers, offerings, schedules, fields, fish, grain, labor, and law. You can slow this image down, and it becomes almost hypnotic. Dawn over a temple courtyard. Cool brick under bare feet. Reeds stacked by a wall. A scribe moistening clay. Priests moving quietly through chambers that smell faintly of oil. Old smoke, wet earth, and stored grain. Fish brought in from water routes. Laborers carrying baskets. Tall jars lined in shadow. An altar waiting at the center of a space whose daily life is half household and half institution. The whole city leaning toward its god as a village might lean toward a river it cannot live without. The source is making a careful point here. A system like that does not feel omnipotent. It feels maintained. And anything maintained can fail. That is why the old creation and conflict traditions matter in this theory. The source begins to pull them in slowly, suggesting that even the Anunnaki inherited a cosmos they did not create from nothing. There were older conflicts, earlier powers, labor burdens, administrative tensions, humanity itself, in some of the Mesopotamian accounts, is not created as a purely celebratory masterpiece. Humanity is a functional solution to a labor problem. Clay mixed with divine substance. Intelligence inserted into mud. Workers made because the system required them. That is such a Sumerian detail. Really. Practical even when cosmic. Less a burst of romantic wonder. More a solution to operational strain. And once the listener accepts that tone, the whole worldview changes. These are powerful beings, yes, But the source wants us to feel that their power was not endless. They had jurisdiction. They had functions. They had authority within a structure. Yet structures imply limits. Decisions must be debated. Labor must be delegated. Boundaries must be maintained. The world is not held together by effortless divinity. It is held together by management, by order, by systems that need constant care. That is where the first chill enters properly. Because if the Anunnaki were not infinite creators, but cosmic administrators, then their leaving stops being impossible. Strange, yes. Frightening, yes. But no longer impossible. They could retreat. They could disagree. They could fail to solve something. They could decide to preserve what knowledge they could and abandon what had become untenable. And the source presses gently toward that conclusion without rushing. One tablet becomes many. One temple economy becomes a network. One network becomes a system. One system begins to look strained. By the time you realize the shape of the argument, you are no longer asking whether the old gods were mighty. You are asking what kind of threat forces mighty administrators to start packing records. The brilliance of the hook is that it answers the title's promise right away, but only in outline. What were they escaping? Something bigger than their authority within the world they governed. The source does not define it fully yet. It only gives you the first image. Clay records, sacred transfers, departure language, a bureaucracy of gods acting like people who have reached the edge of what can still be managed. So tonight we stay with that edge a little longer. Stay in the museum hush. Stay with the faint red clay and the wedge marks that outlived empires. Stay with the unsettling dignity of an old administrative text that may be preserving the opening move of divine retreat. Let the listener feel the difference between destruction and withdrawal, between punishment and procedure, between a God who acts in anger and a God who closes archives before leaving. Because the next step is to walk deeper into the world that produced those archives, to understand how the Anunnaki were organized, how their authority was distributed, and why a civilization that treated temples as literal divine households might have noticed, slowly at first, that the household staff was still there, the walls were still there, the rituals were still there, and yet the resident presence was becoming strangely, carefully, irreversibly distant. To understand why departure would matter so much, we have to sit inside the old system a little longer. A retreat is only frightening when the thing retreating once felt stable. If the Anunnaki had always been distant abstractions, their silence would not have produced much shock. But the source builds a different picture. It describes a world in which divine presence was woven into administration so tightly that temple, city, economy, ritual, and authority all breathed together like parts of one body. The name itself already helps create that mood. The Anunnaki are framed as beings of heavenly descent who are active upon the earth. The exact etymology is debated, and ancient language is rarely as simple as modern subtitles want it to be. But the source uses the phrase carefully because it preserves both distance and involvement. These are not village spirits tied to one tree or one spring. They belong to a larger order, yet they are also here. distributed through the terrestrial world, attached to cities, households, decrees, and the practical machinery of civilization. Once you let that settle, the temple city becomes easier to imagine. Take a Sumerian city at dawn. Not the dramatic version from a documentary trailer, but the ordinary living one. Mud brick catching first light. Water carried in jars. Fish smell near storage rooms. Grain dust in the air. Reed mats. Narrow passages. Footsteps. Distant voices still low with sleep. Then the temple rising above it all, not merely as a place of worship, but as the god's estate, the god's working residence, the god's administrative heart on earth. The source insists on this point because modern people tend to imagine religion as a set of beliefs held privately by human minds. The old Sumerian system, by contrast, feels corporate in the most sacred sense. The city belongs to its patron deity. The temple is the deity's household. Priests, administrators, laborers, fishers, herders, brewers, potters, scribes, all in some sense maintain that household. Human kings do not simply rule in their own right. Their legitimacy arrives through divine allocation. Authority descends. It is assigned, ratified, recorded, and there is something almost soothing in the order of it, at least before the unease begins. The source describes councils, assemblies, executive gods, wider bodies of authority, fate itself handled like something that can be decreed and distributed rather than vaguely hoped for. I have always found that detail especially eerie because it makes the cosmos feel less magical and more procedural. The Anunnaki are not only worshipped, they are those who decree fates. The phrase sounds poetic in English, but the source reads it with bureaucratic weight. This is not mood. This is jurisdiction. At the top sits high cosmic authority. Beneath that, the great gods, figures like Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Utu, Nana, and others depending on the tradition and period. Beneath them, a wider administrative body linked to heaven and earth. The names matter, but even more than the names, the structure matters. Councils imply consultation. Consultation implies limit. Limit implies that no single figure is simply doing anything whatsoever without regard to order. That is where the source begins quietly changing the emotional frame. Gods who hold meeting structure are not gods of pure unlimited whim. They are powers functioning inside a maintained hierarchy. Great powers, yes, powers far beyond ordinary human life, yes, but still organized, still bounded by role, a domain, precedent, conflict, and responsibility. And once role enters the picture, so does burden. The source then moves into the older conflict traditions and creation accounts, not to sensationalize them, but to show that the system was never effortless. Even before the flood stories and city laments, there are memories of divine labor problems, tensions between older and younger powers, and humans created not simply out of delight, but out of practical necessity. Clay mixed with blood. Intelligence transferred into a worker species. failed attempts before viable form. The tone, as the source presents it, is almost experimental. Honestly, it is that wordless practicality that makes the whole thesis persuasive at the mood level, even if many of the conclusions remain speculative. The ancient world here does not look like a fairy tale. It looks like a system solving for strain. And because it is solving for strain, it is already admitting that strain exists. Picture the scene the source wants you to imagine, though it never says it in quite this slow way. A god associated with wisdom and deep waters, standing inside a world that requires labor beyond what divine ranks wish to perform. A council debating. A compromise forming. Humans made as a solution. Cities assigned. Domains distributed. Temples established as operational centers. Resources tracked. Offerings scheduled. Agricultural output managed. Water systems supervised. Boundaries between realms maintained. Now pause there, because the next question rises almost by itself. If such a system required all this structure to keep running, what happens when the structure begins to fail? The source argues that this is the correct way to read the Anunnaki, not as omnipotent creators who simply changed their minds one afternoon, but as immensely capable administrators whose world depended on ongoing maintenance. They had power, but not endless power. They had reach, but not absolute reach. They could create systems, manage domains, decree within order, but they still faced conflict, limits, and inherited instability. That inherited instability matters. The source brings in older mythic wars and generational transitions to emphasize that the cosmos the Anunnaki governed was already the result of prior rearrangement. They inherited a reordered world. They did not originate reality out of nothing. So from the beginning, they occupy something like stewardship more than ultimate authorship. That distinction is subtle, but it supports the later claim beautifully. Stewards can be overwhelmed by the thing they steward. And then the source leans into another important detail. The earliest written records from temple cities do not show a slow discovery of divine governance. They already assume it. The city-state appears with divine patronage built in. The structure arrives on the page already functioning. That does not prove supernatural descent in a modern evidentiary sense, of course. But within the source's argument, it strengthens the feeling that the system was imposed from above or from before, not slowly invented in public view. In other words, by the time we can read the records, the machine is already running. So let us walk through that machine in the slowest possible way. A temple kitchen, warming before sunrise. Clay bowls stacked by a wall. A worker, checking grain allotments. The scribe, bending over a small, moist tablet. Fish laid out in neat rows from river or gulf waters. A priest entering an inner room where ritual implements are stored. Lamps trimmed. Incense prepared. Offerings assigned to a schedule older than any single worker alive. Outside, the city waking. Inside, the god's estate moving into its day. That is what the source means when it says the temples were not merely symbols. They were operational households. The god's literal residence in civic form. The economy and the theology meet there so closely that separating them becomes almost impossible. And that is why absence would be catastrophic. If the god is no longer fully in residence, what happens to the city that exists as that residence? If the council still exists in heaven or in some distant realm, but the local administrative presence weakens, what happens to the ordinary rhythms that once felt guaranteed? The source does not answer that yet in full. It only wants the listener to feel how much would be lost if this arrangement began to thin. This is also where the story grows slightly sad, not only eerie. Because once you imagine the temple household as lived reality, later abandonment becomes more than a theory. It becomes a domestic wound. Empty service rooms, rituals still performed, but with a different tone. Priests maintaining an address after the resident has moved. Offerings left in spaces that still smell of smoke and oil, but no longer feel inhabited in the same way. You know that feeling when a house still contains furniture, cups, blankets, and ordinary light, but the person who made it feel alive is gone. The source is building toward that sensation on a civilizational scale. The bread is still baked. The lamps are still trimmed. The records are still kept. Yet somewhere inside the routine, a silence grows. Not sudden, not dramatic, but persistent enough that everyone who works close to the center begins to sense it. The temple remains. The city remains. The words remain. The resident's certainty does not. And to make that later withdrawal plausible, it keeps returning to one idea: limits. The Anunnaki can decree fates, but the source asks us to notice that fate is still handled through assembly and structure. They can create humans, but only through procedure and necessity. They can govern cities, but through distributed estates and staffed temples. They can maintain order, but order itself appears as something that must be held in place, not something that naturally stays perfect forever. That is the hinge of the whole thesis. If order must be held, then a time may come when holding it fails. By now, even without reaching Eridu or the King List or the flood debate, the listener should already feel the emotional architecture of the theory. This is not a tale of cosmic beings who suddenly become frightened for no reason. It is a tale of an old system revealing itself as finite. The archive tablet from the beginning no longer feels isolated. It begins to look like the quiet administrative edge of a much wider realization, and that realization may have begun first where systems always reveal their strain, in places of maintenance. A failed boundary, a labor burden, a city too dependent on one sacred center, a temple that no longer feels fully inhabited, a council forced to debate what once would have seemed unthinkable. The source is careful not to leap too quickly, and I think that is why it works. It lets the dread arrive by procedure, which somehow feels more convincing than spectacle. So we stay here, in the old temple world, just a little longer. Hear the stylus press into clay. Hear sandals over worn floor. Smell damp earth, fish oil, lamp smoke, woven raid, grain. Let the city feel real enough that departure will hurt when it comes. Let the divine hierarchy feel stable enough that its fracture will matter. Let the listener understand that a god in this world is not merely a name in a hymn, but a resident power in an administered place. Because once that picture is clear, we are ready for the first true sign of breakdown. Not yet in the flood. Not yet in the final departure language. But in the oldest city, where foundations shift, architecture changes, and the first divine household begins to look less like a residence and more like a memory, that is where the unease becomes archaeological. That is where stone and water begin to say what the archive only hinted. That is where the story starts to move from system to failure, from divine order to divine retreat, and from sacred administration into the first slow evidence that even the oldest houses of the gods were no longer entirely safe to live in. The first true sign of breakdown does not arrive as a scream. It arrives as architecture that may sound almost disappointingly calm at first. No flood wall collapsing. No god descending in visible terror. No sky splitting open. Just mud brick, foundation lines, room plans, floor levels, water pressure, and the slow archaeological honesty of a place that can no longer keep pretending to be what it once was. But honestly, that is what makes Eridu so unsettling. The oldest city in southern Mesopotamian memory does not look like a dramatic legend when you first approach it. It looks like a place where sacred residence became increasingly difficult to maintain. The source brings us there carefully, and I think that pace matters. After the museum tablet, after the temple bureaucracy, after the realization that divine power in Sumer may have been organized more like governance than like fantasy, Eridu becomes the first place where the theory touches dirt. Not metaphorical dirt. Actual earth. Excavated layers. Broken walls. Rebuilt foundations. Rooms rising over older rooms. Centuries pressed downward into one mound by time. Abandonment. Flood silts. Wind. And the stubborn habit of later builders using what older ground still offered. If you were standing here with me at dawn on that mound, you would not see a glittering lost city. You would see a low, weathered rise, pale earth, broken contours, trenches cut by modern excavation, wind worrying the edges of exposed mud brick, a thin, dry smell in the air, mixed with salt, dust, and the faint mineral odor of ancient soil long kept from daylight. That silence is different from museum silence. Museum silence is curated. Ruin silence feels earned. Eridu matters because the source treats it not merely as an old city, but as the first major residence of Enki, Lord of the deep, sweet waters, wisdom, craft, and technical intelligence. In Sumerian tradition, Eridu is not just early. It is primordial in civic memory, the first city, the place where divine order first roots itself in earth. That gives every later change there an almost intimate significance. If the oldest divine household begins to fail, then the theory of retreat stops sounding outrageous and starts sounding tragically procedural. The excavators found many successive temple levels at Eridu, 19 in the classic count. That number by itself already creates a strange sensation. Not one temple, not one sacred founding event. Repetition, rebuilding, return, renewal attempted again and again over the same charged ground. The earliest shrine is small, almost modest, yet startling in what it implies. It sits on virgin soil. It is planned, oriented, deliberate. Not the casual shelter of a wandering village, but something more formal, as if sacred architecture arrived already knowing what it wanted to be. I have always found that detail almost eerie. Human settlements usually ramble into complexity. Eridu's sacred center, in the source's telling, feels as though it begins with intention already in place. A household prepared for an occupant expected to matter. So let us enter it slowly. A low temple chamber. Fresh plaster, once pale against lamplight. Reed matting underfoot. Offerings arranged in bowls. Small altars. Narrow storage spaces. The smell of oil and damp clay. Maybe fish from the marshlands, because Eridu is a city of water memory. Maybe incense. Maybe wool garments drying in the cooler shade. Outside, the first community gathering around this sacred center. Inside, a place prepared not only to honor a god, but to house a relationship between divine administration and earthly life. Then, centuries begin to stack. Temple over temple. Floor over floor. One sacred plan revised, enlarged, repaired, replaced, and raised above what came before. At first, the sequence feels strong. Expansion suggests confidence. The site grows. The architecture matures. Ritual importance deepens. The god's house does not vanish. It develops. This is exactly what one would expect from a living sacred center with real institutional weight. A functioning divine estate should accumulate complexity. And then, slowly, the mood changes. The source pays close attention to a turning point, often associated with later temple phases where the architecture becomes less intimate, less residential in feel, less like a place a deity truly inhabits, and more like a structure preserving sacred memory after presence has become uncertain. This is where archaeology becomes emotional if you let it. A floor plan can carry grief. A building can reveal that it still wants to be a house while no longer fully succeeding. Some of the later structures at Eridu seem more formal, more monumental in one sense, yet less personal in another. The old domestic sacredness thins out. Rooms that once implied lived divine household routine begin to feel administrative, commemorative, or defensive. The source frames this not as ordinary development, but as adaptation under stress. The site is not simply changing style. It is compensating. Compensating for what? For one thing, the environment itself is unstable. Eridu belongs to a landscape shaped by water, and water is generous only until it is not. The source emphasizes the rising water table. Marshland shifts, salinization pressure, unstable foundations, and the long, difficult relationship between sacred building and a landscape that does not always agree to stay still. That matters especially here because Eridu belongs to Enki, whose identity is tied to the Abzu, the deep, fresh waters beneath the earth. If even the water city begins struggling with water, the symbolism becomes almost too sharp. Picture the ground beneath the temple changing over generations. Moisture where it should not be. Foundations stressed. Brick softening at the edges. Repairs becoming more frequent. Builders raising new layers above compromised older ones. Priests and workers adjusting their routines, perhaps without ever speaking openly of decline. The rituals continue. The city still names the god. The archives still function. But maintenance grows heavier. The household is becoming harder to keep. And this is one of the source's strongest interpretive moves. It does not claim there was one dramatic day when the god visibly departed. It suggests instead a long administrative retreat, the kind that begins with subtle changes in architecture, with a sacred center no longer being designed as if the resident will remain indefinitely. If that sounds abstract, think of a house where the owner still pays for repairs, still keeps certain rooms open, still allows the staff to maintain appearances, but quietly stops living there in the old way. You know that feeling when a room is technically in use, but no longer inhabited with conviction. The cushions remain. The dishes remain. The lamp is lit, but the rhythm is wrong. Presence has become ceremonial. That is the emotional atmosphere the source wants us to feel at Eridu. It helps that Eridu is tied so closely to origins. A later temple, in a less mythically weighted city, might feel like ordinary historical decay. But the first city, the oldest divine center, the place memory itself treats as foundational, is different. If retreat begins there, or at least becomes visible there first, then the rest of the story acquires an order that feels disturbingly logical. The oldest house goes uncertain first. The first administrative node starts failing. The deepest water domain becomes unstable. This is not random catastrophe. It is systemic strain, showing itself at a core point. The source also wants the listener to notice that Eridu's temple sequence is not a story of immediate abandonment. It is a story of persistence, rebuilding, adjustment, continued investment. That matters because it means the system did not simply panic and run. It attempted maintenance. It raised floors, renewed structures, continued sacred attention. In other words, exactly what administrators do when a center still matters but has become difficult to sustain. That patience is chilling in its own way. Fast collapse can be understood emotionally. Slow decline is worse. Slow decline means meetings, decisions, repair budgets. In the ancient sense, rituals continued, partly because stopping them would admit too much. Workers learning new routines around failing conditions. Priests noticing what no longer feels quite the same. Scribes still writing. Offerings still arriving. The whole system acting as though continuity itself might solve the problem. But continuity is not always stronger than environment. At Eridu, the source suggests, something more than cultural drift is visible. The city that should have remained the most stable divine household begins to carry the marks of adaptation under pressure. Not just age, stress. The old residence is still honored, but the feeling of an active dwelling fades. This is where the theory of divine retreat stops being merely literary. It begins to inhabit architecture. The gods may not have vanished in thunder. They may have receded through floor plans. And if that sounds too poetic, the source grounds it again in physicality. Mud brick does not lie elegantly. Foundations do not flatter. Rebuilt temples tell on their builders. The site records every attempt to maintain sacred order against a landscape that was becoming less cooperative. The marsh edge shifts. the sweet waters behave differently. Salt intrudus. Stability costs more. The first city becomes a patient argument with ground and memory. I think that is why Eridu lingers in the mind. It feels less like a lost city and more like a house being kept alive after the person everyone built it for has begun spending less and less time there. The staff continues. The account books continue. Repairs continue. But conviction thins. Presence withdraws into ritual. Eventually, even the repairs begin to feel like tribute to absence. And all the while, the older traditions surrounding Enki deepen the unease. This is the god associated with cunning preservation, with technical knowledge, with the warning that later reaches the flood survivor through a wall. If his own first city shows signs of long strain and reduced residence, the implication becomes almost too clean. The one who will later preserve knowledge is already connected to a center learning how to survive through decline. So stand a little longer on that mound. Let the wind pass over broken walls. Let the trench shadows lengthen. Let your eyes move from one exposed brick line to another, and imagine the vanished rooms rising briefly in the mind. A storage niche, a threshold, a courtyard edge, a place where water vessels once stood, a place where an offering table caught lamplight, a place where a god was expected to be near enough that architecture itself was shaped around that expectation. Now imagine that expectation cooling, not vanishing at once, but cooling. A chamber rebuilt slightly differently because no one fully believes the old arrangement still works. A residence becoming a shrine becoming a memorialized center, a living divine house becoming an address where ritual is performed for a presence increasingly managed at distance. That is the mood of the source's reading, and it is deeply effective. By the time Eridu settles into the listener's imagination, the title question has changed again. What were the Anunnaki escaping? Now it begins to sound less like a science fiction question and more like an administrative one. What makes the oldest divine household too difficult to keep? What pressure forces sacred residence to become sacred memory? What environmental or cosmic instability makes even the Waterlord's city begin adapting like a place no longer expected to remain fully viable forever? We are not at the flood yet. We are not even at the great decision point yet. But we are now standing at the first place where the whole divine system starts to feel physically tired. And once you notice fatigue in sacred architecture, the next thing that changes is time itself. Records begin behaving strangely. Numbers swell beyond comfort. Reigns lengthen to impossible scales. The memory of governance stops sounding human in duration and starts sounding like a civilization trying to measure a crisis that lasted far longer than ordinary kings or ordinary calendars can explain. Eridu gives us the house under strain. The next records will give us the clock that strain produced. Once Eridu begins to feel tired, time itself starts looking untrustworthy. That is not the kind of sentence most historians enjoy hearing. And fairly enough, numbers are supposed to clarify. Dates are supposed to discipline imagination. Lists are supposed to help the mind sit up straight. But the source takes us next to one of the most famous and most troublesome records in early Mesopotamian tradition, precisely because its numbers refuse to behave. The Sumerian King List, preserved most famously on the Weld Blundell prism. does not merely record rulers. It preserves duration in a way that feels, at first, impossible. The line that opens the antediluvian section is famous for good reason. After the kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. There it is again. Descent. Not invention from below. Not gradual social development in the ordinary telling. Kingship comes down. Authority is installed. The first city receives it. In the source's framework, that sentence becomes more than mythic ceremony. It sounds like administrative transfer language. Authority allocated to a site. Governance seated. A system beginning. Then come the numbers. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Alongar for 36,000 years. Menluana for 43,200 years. The figures continue through a sequence of pre-flood kings whose reigns stretch across spans that make any ordinary chronology collapse in embarrassment. Read literally as solar years. They are impossible for human monarchs. Read casually. They become fantasy. Read dismissively. They become proof that the whole document is useless for serious historical thought. The source does not accept that dismissal. And honestly, I understand why. Because the King List is not sloppy. It is not drunken storytelling scratched on a tavern wall. It is structured, ordered, preserved in learned tradition, repeated across manuscripts with meaningful consistency. The numbers are absurd in one sense, yes, but they are absurd with precision. Ancient scribes were perfectly capable of care, and care is exactly what these texts display. If you were standing with me in front of the prism itself, turning it in low museum light, you would probably feel that odd mixture of reverence and suspicion that certain artifacts produce. The clay surface is formal. The columns run with clean intention. The signs do not look like nonsense. They look like something copied because it mattered. That is what makes the giant reign so stubborn. They are not random enough to laugh off easily. Mainstream explanation usually offers one of several paths. Mythic exaggeration, symbolic numerology, prestige amplification, a literary way of placing antediluvian rulers in a deep, holy past before ordinary history begins. All of those explanations have merit, and the source is careful enough to acknowledge that many scholars remain in that broad lane. But then it tilts gently away from it. What if the impossible reigns are not fantasy in the simplest sense? What if they are encoding duration differently? That suggestion is where the atmosphere starts to shift again. Not because the source proves it beyond doubt. It does not. But because the possibility matches the mood of everything that has come before. We have already been asked to think of the Anunnaki as administrators under strain, not omnipotent storybook beings. We have already seen the oldest city treated like a sacred center, struggling with prolonged maintenance. So when the King List presents absurdly long spans before the flood, the source reads them not as boastful nonsense, but as the record of very long management cycles. This is where the shrinking numbers become important. Before the flood, the reigns are enormous. After the flood, they contract dramatically. Kings still reign for long periods by later standards, but nothing like the impossible antediluvian durations. The source treats that contrast not as mythic decoration alone, but as memory of two worlds governed under different conditions. One world stretched into deep crisis time. Another world normalized into recognizably human scale after catastrophe and reset. I have always found that pattern strangely hypnotic. Numbers that begin huge and then steadily shrink. A sequence like breath slowly returning after suffocation. A civilization recording not only who ruled, but the changing rhythm of time itself as conditions altered. The source leans on the sexagesimal structure here as well, the old Mesopotamian numerical habit that makes certain totals feel less arbitrary than they first appear. These figures are constructed, built in a system, repeated through ordered mathematical language. Again, that does not prove the source's interpretation, but it does make casual dismissal feel too easy. Something is being said through these numbers besides simple absurdity. So let us imagine the antediluvian section not as fairy tale, but as compressed crisis memory. Not one king lounging on a throne for 30,000 years. Not that. Instead, long administrative eras attached to named centers and named rulers, perhaps representing dynastic stewardship, sacred regimes, or extended periods of controlled governance in a world not yet fully collapsing, but already far from stable. The names remain personal because human memory prefers faces. The numbers remain enormous because the thing being measured was longer than one life. Longer than several lives. Longer than what later scribes felt comfortable translating into ordinary scale. The effect of that reading is remarkable. The King List stops being childish and starts sounding tired. That is exactly the word I would use. Tired. Not because the document is weak, but because the durations begin to feel like a civilization, remembering that the crisis before the flood was not sudden. It was prolonged, managed, endured, held together for vast stretches until finally something gave way. Picture a scribe copying those old names centuries later. He may not know the original unit fully. He may not know whether he is preserving literal reign, dynastic age, or some sacredly encoded cycle. But he knows not to smooth the numbers down. He copies them as received because the extremity is part of the memory. These were the long ages, the held ages, the almost impossible ages before the break. And suddenly Eridu returns in a new light. If the first city already showed architectural signs of prolonged adaptation, then the King List may be doing in numbers what Eridu does in mud brick. Both preserve duration under strain. One in rebuilt sacred space. The other in compressed chronology. Architecture says the house kept being adjusted. The King List says rule kept being extended. Together they begin to feel less like disconnected oddities and more like two views of the same drawn-out emergency. The source loves that kind of convergence, and I think this is one of the places where it earns the right to be eerie, because it does not rely on one astonishing text. It uses mood across categories. Archive list, temple ruin, regnal sequence. Each alone might be handled conventionally. Together they begin to point toward a world whose final collapse came only after a very long stretch of difficult maintenance. You know that feeling when a family says someone has been ill for a long time, and only later do you understand that every ordinary meal, every conversation, Every birthday in that house was quietly shaped by the illness. I think the source wants the antediluvian ages to feel like that. The world before the flood was still functioning in some sense. Kingship still existed. Cities still mattered. Temples still stood. But everything may already have been happening under the shadow of a problem too large to solve cleanly. Then the flood is no longer the story. It becomes the end of the story. That is a powerful reframing. The source is careful not to force literal certainty. It does not say we can prove beyond all doubt that Alulim's reign was a crisis metric rather than a lifetime. It says the standard reading may be too shallow for the mood and structure of the evidence. It invites the listener to treat the numbers as deliberate memory, not clumsy embellishment. That is enough to transform the emotional experience of the text. And if we accept even part of that invitation, the King List starts sounding less like royal propaganda and more like a long, exhausted ledger kept by a civilization that knew it had been holding something together for far too long. Kingship descended from heaven. Yes, but then it remained, perhaps under conditions increasingly difficult to sustain, until the antediluvian world finally reached its terminal threshold. You can almost hear the rhythm of it if you read the names slowly. One city, one kingship, another city, another reign, another terrible length of time. Again and again. The repetition becomes almost lull-like, which is exactly what makes it uncanny. The numbers soothe and disturb at once. Deep time wrapped in order stretched beyond comfort. Authority still present, but increasingly associated with a world no later community could quite imagine without calling it impossible. This is where the source becomes especially good at sleep storytelling. Because the idea is vast, but the delivery remains calm. A prism under soft light. Clay faces turning. Tiny wedges carrying impossibly long years. The listener is not asked to panic, only to notice that the old world did not remember itself as brief. It remembered itself as prolonged, stretched, burdened, and then broken. And there is another subtle effect to this reading. The kings themselves begin to feel less like colorful personalities and more like placeholders of continuity. Not empty names, exactly. More like anchor points. Administrative markers attached to spans so long that individual biography would have meant less than endurance itself. The title of rule matters more than anecdote. The seat matters more than temperament. The system is trying to keep time through offices, through succession, through naming, because the larger world is becoming harder to hold. That is a very strange kind of sadness. A civilization remembering itself through offices because ordinary memory could not stretch far enough to contain the length of the burden. And when the numbers finally begin to shrink after the flood, the mood shifts with them. Rule becomes more human in scale. Time becomes breathable again. The impossible ages recede. The old prolonged emergency is over, not because it was solved elegantly, but because it reached its breaking point and took the world with it. After that, kingship continues in a damaged, reduced, normalized world. In that sense, the King List is almost like a pulse record. Before the break, the pulse is stretched into long suspended beats. After the break, it returns in shorter intervals. Not healthy exactly, but survivable. Measurable by mortal life again. The source does not ask us to worship that interpretation as certainty. It asks us to feel how surprisingly coherent it becomes when placed beside Eridu, beside the archive tablet, beside the idea of divine administration under strain. A first city showing architectural fatigue. A list of rulers preserving impossible lengths. A later flood remembered as terminal rupture. The pieces do not prove the theory alone, but together they create a mood strong enough that the theory starts to feel less like invention and more like one possible reading of a civilization trying to remember collapse without surrendering all order in the telling. And once time itself begins to feel like a record of crisis, practical texts become more ominous too. Because if the antediluvian ages were long management cycles, if the first cities were already adapting under strain, then wisdom literature from the threshold of catastrophe may no longer be ordinary wisdom literature at all. Advice about wells, roads, household discipline, trust, property, and caution may start sounding less like etiquette and more like continuity planning. A father teaching a son how to live carefully because the larger system is no longer reliable. That is where the story moves next. From impossible years to practical instruction. From vast duration to intimate warning. From kingship on the prism to a human voice speaking quietly in a room, telling the next generation how to survive when the old guarantees begin to fail. After the impossible reigns and the long exhausted ages of the King List, the source does something very clever. It lowers its voice. That change matters. We move away from huge numbers, away from kingship descending from heaven, away from the broad sweep of antediluvian administration, and towards something smaller, quieter, and almost disappointingly ordinary at first glance. A father speaks to a son. A set of instructions is copied onto clay. Advice is given about roads, wells, speech, property, labor, trust, conduct, and the management of a household. It is the sort of text that modern readers are tempted to place in the calm, safe category marked wisdom literature, and then move on. But the source refuses to let us do that. It takes us to Shuruppak, a city whose very name already trembles with flood memory, because in Mesopotamian tradition, Shuruppak stands near the threshold of the great catastrophe. And there, in the instructions of Shuruppak, the tone of the archive changes from cosmic administration to intimate preparation. If the King List sounded like deep time stretched thin, this text sounds like someone trying to make sure useful habits survive whatever is coming next. Imagine the tablet itself first. Not grand, not monumental. A modest piece of clay, rectangular, palm-sized, covered in lines that would have been copied and recopied because they were deemed worth preserving. The room around it is dim. A lamp burns low. A scribe bends over damp clay. The stylus moves with care, because even practical advice becomes sacred when a world feels unstable. There is a small sound each time the stylus enters the surface. A dry, soft pressure, almost like a careful breath being turned into marks. The text presents itself as instruction from Shuruppak to his son Ziusudra in one tradition. or in related manuscript lines as an inherited wisdom voice from an older generation toward the next. That frame is important. It is parental, intimate, not a king proclaiming law to strangers, but a father pressing caution into the mind of someone who will have to live after him. That alone changes the emotional temperature. The King List measured crisis in enormous spans. This text measures it in habits. The source lingers on that distinction, and it is right to do so. Because if we read the instructions of Shuruppak as ordinary moral teaching, the text remains interesting but unsurprising. If we read it in the context of prolonged systems failure, temple withdrawal, unstable kingship duration, and looming flood tradition, it begins to sound more like continuity planning. That phrase may sound modern, but the mood fits. How do you preserve a civilization when you suspect the larger structures may not hold? You do not begin with poetry. You begin with household procedure. The advice itself often appears plain. Do not move carelessly in dangerous places. Be cautious about roads. Be cautious about speech. Honor obligations. Avoid theft. Manage labor fairly. Do not let your household dissolve into disorder. Do not neglect practical warning signs. Protect what is yours without becoming reckless. The source asks us to hear those lines, not as timeless sayings floating above history, but as knowledge sharpened by a specific atmosphere. A world where institutions once offered broad stability may no longer be reliable enough. Therefore, the household must become stronger. I have always found that kind of wisdom more haunting than grand prophecy. A grand prophecy gives you spectacle. A practical warning gives you mood. It tells you what sort of fear has already settled into daily life. Take one example the source emphasizes. The line comparing fate to a wet riverbank. Unstable, crumbling, ready to give way under pressure. That is not merely pretty language. It feels geological, physical. A person who has lived near water knows what a wet bank is. It looks firm until it does not. It gives way not always with warning, but with enough warning that experienced people learn to watch the signs. In the source's reading, that one image begins to glow. Fate is not a decree carved in calm stone. Fate is a soaked edge underfoot. You can almost hear how a father would say it. Do not trust appearances near the river. Do not lean where the ground is soft. Do not mistake surface stillness for safety. The text does not always phrase it exactly that way, of course, but the mood is there. And once you have spent time with Eridu's unstable foundations and the King List's exhausted durations, these little instructions start sounding less like manners and more like survival reflexes. The source pays particular attention to how often the text circles back to caution in movement and relation. Roads, neighbors, workers, property lines, speech acts, obligations. That may seem far from flood at first, yet if a world is entering prolonged instability, those are exactly the areas where continuity breaks first. People stop trusting exchange. Roads become uncertain. Wells become contested. Labor becomes fragile. A household that does not know how to discipline itself inwardly will not survive outward disorder for long. So the instructions of Shuruppak become, in this theory, a kind of pre-disaster compression of usable civilization. Not the whole archive, Not the whole temple system, just what can be pressed into a father's voice and handed down across generations in case the larger scaffolding fails. This is where the source becomes deeply effective as sleep storytelling. Because instead of asking the listener to picture only gods and cataclysms, it invites the listener into a quieter room. A father seated in evening dimness. A child or young heir listening. Outside, perhaps, city life continues. Animals make small sounds. Water moves somewhere in the dark. A lamp gives off the faint smell of heated oil. Inside, words are chosen carefully because practical memory may soon matter more than grand confidence. Honestly, it is one of the saddest shifts in the whole theory. When a civilization begins compressing itself into household advice, something larger has already been lost, or is expected to be lost. The source does not overplay this. It simply asks us to notice the text's texture. It is cautious, disciplined, specific in the way danger makes people specific. Be careful with commitments. Be careful with strangers. Be careful with boundaries. Be careful with speech. A stable world can afford more looseness. An unstable one trains attention. And once that thought settles in, even the apparently moral lines take on new shadows. Ethical order is not only about virtue now. It becomes structural preservation. If people lie, steal, neglect obligations, abuse, labor, ignore practical warning, or let resentment spread through daily exchange, then the only scale of society still available, the household, the local network, the surviving line of transmission, begins to crack as well. In a world expecting reduced divine support, ordinary decency becomes infrastructural. That may sound severe, but ancient survival often is. The source also emphasizes that Shuruppak belongs right near the hinge of the flood tradition. That is crucial. This is not random wisdom from a peaceful century later. This is wisdom attached by memory to the generation standing nearest the break. Whether every line in the text was composed at exactly that historical threshold is, of course, debated. Scribal transmission is complex. Texts gather layers. Copies survive from later dates. None of that weakens the mood the source is drawing out. In fact, it may strengthen it. Later scribes kept copying this text because its cautions continued to feel essential. That is the difference between charming wisdom and survival wisdom. Charming wisdom can fade. Survival wisdom is recopied. Imagine the tablet being recopied generations later in a schoolroom or temple workshop. The young scribe may no longer face the exact same danger as the first hearers. Still, the text is preserved. Why? Because old catastrophe leaves behind habits. Because a people that remembers collapse will keep copying advice that sounds plain to outsiders and vital to insiders. This is where the continuity with the archive tablet from the beginning becomes unexpectedly moving. There, sacred objects and essential records seem to be transferred and protected. Here, practical patterns of conduct are also being preserved. Different scale, same instinct. Save what still works. Carry forward what can outlast the break. The source even encourages the listener to notice the difference between dramatic revelation and inherited caution. Grand myths, announce events. Wisdom texts train survivors. If the Anunnaki were indeed reducing presence, if temple residence was becoming thinner, if kingship itself had already entered crisis time, then these instructions would be exactly the sort of literature you would expect to survive near the threshold, not because they explain everything, but because they help people endure whatever cannot be explained in time. And there is a final, eerie detail beneath all this. The speaker in the Shuruppak tradition is attached, by later flood memory, to the father of the survivor. That does not prove literal disaster manual status, but it does place the whole document in a genealogy of warning. A father speaks. A son receives. A world later breaks. The line continues. You know that feeling when an older relative gives advice that sounds slightly excessive until many years later, when you realize they were not being fussy. They were remembering something you never had to live through. The instructions of Shuruppak carry that same texture. Do this. Avoid that. Speak carefully. Walk carefully. Maintain order. It is the voice of inherited caution, and inherited caution is often just memory, wearing ordinary clothes. So stay in that room a little longer. Feel the clay damp under the stylus. Feel the small seriousness of each line. Hear the fatherly tone that keeps refusing spectacle. Smell oil smoke, old reed, dust, and earth. Outside, perhaps, the city still appears normal. Inside, the text behaves as if normality should not be trusted too much. This is why the source treats the instructions of Shuruppak as one of the most revealing pieces in the whole chain. It shows that by the time the archive begins, quietly preserving sacred objects, and by the time the King List remembers endless governance, there is also a human layer of preparation happening beneath the level of kings and gods. Households are being trained to survive reduced guarantees. And once households are being trained like that, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who knew the guarantees were failing first? Was it only human experience drawing these lessons together? Or were the gods themselves already debating what to do about a system slipping beyond recovery? The source now moves from wisdom into assembly, from father to son into counsel and oath, from private caution into the terrifying moment when divine administration itself must decide whether the world can still be managed. That is where the room grows colder. That is where Enlil, Enki, and the others enter not as distant names in a hymn, but as participants in triage. The human instructions remain on the tablet. The household advice remains in the room. But above that room, above the city, above the deep, tired years, a larger meeting is beginning, and its decision will determine whether these instructions become merely wisdom or the first surviving tools of a world after collapse. By the time the source reaches Atrahasis, the whole mood of the story has changed. We are no longer only in museums, ruins, prisms, or household advice. We are in the room where the decision is made. That room is not described for us in modern architectural detail, of course, but the source reads the Atrahasis tradition as if we ought to feel its atmosphere all the same. A divine assembly, a council under pressure, not a glorious parade of omnipotence, but the grim stillness of administrators who have run through lesser remedies and are now staring at a larger failure. I think that is one of the boldest and most persuasive parts of the source's framing. It turns the flood from mythic punishment into triage. To understand why that matters, we have to begin slightly before the flood itself. In Atrahasis, humanity exists because the divine order had already been solving a labor problem. The lesser gods had borne burdens. Complaint rose. Work had become intolerable. A solution was formed. Humanity was made. Clay, divine substance, breath, or animation, intelligence enough to work. Civilization begins not in leisure, but in delegation. That background is crucial because it means humans were part of a system from the beginning. Not random creatures multiplying in a world the gods happened to notice later. They were built into the economy of maintenance. Fields, canals, offerings, cities, labor. The whole managed order depended on them. And then their number grows. The old text famously says their noise disturbs Enlil. Many modern listeners hear that and picture a comically irritable god covering his ears because humans are too loud. The source refuses that shallow reading. It suggests noise here may preserve the memory of systemic pressure, population density, ritual load, ecological burden, urban strain. The sound of too many interlocking demands in a system already under stress. Noise not as annoyance only, but as overload. Honestly, that makes the text immediately darker. Not because it becomes more violent, but because it becomes more plausible. Large systems rarely collapse because someone is merely irritated. They collapse because thresholds are crossed. Human multiplication in the Atrahasis tradition may be the narrative language for a world whose carrying capacity, divine, Shivic, environmental, or all three, is being exceeded. At first, the divine response is not total destruction. That detail matters enormously. Lesser interventions come first. Plague, drought, famine, reduced fertility, pressure applied in stages. The source treats this sequence not as moral whim, but as escalating attempts to reduce system load without complete annihilation. That is exactly how triage behaves. You do not begin with the final measure if smaller measures might work, and yet the smaller measures do not hold. Again and again, humanity survives. Again and again, the burden returns. In the source's reading, this is the true heart of the Atrahasis problem. The world is no longer easily governable by existing means. Administrative correction fails. Partial reduction fails. The old order cannot regain equilibrium. By the time the final assembly forms, the gods are not deciding between peace and cruelty. They are deciding how much collapse they are willing to authorize in order to preserve anything at all. That is a terrible kind of decision, and the source wants us to feel its coldness. So imagine the chamber, not a fantasy throne room dripping with modern spectacle. Something quieter, heavy, sacred authority gathered into stillness. Lamps, shadows, breath. A space where words matter because once spoken they become policy. Enlil appears in the source as the hard line of system preservation through drastic reduction. Enki appears as the dissenter, the technician of survival, the one who sees that total destruction will cost too much, perhaps morally, perhaps administratively, perhaps both. Other powers are present as well, but the emotional tension gathers around those two poles. Severe order, cunning preservation. The assembly comes to decision. An oath is made. Secrecy binds the participants. The catastrophe will proceed. The source reads this not as theatrical wrath, but as formal authorization. That shift in tone changes everything. The flood is no longer simply unleashed. It is approved. If you slow that moment enough, the horror deepens. A room quiet enough to hear fabric move. A council that already knows lesser remedies failed. A decision spoken in ritual form. Silence after the decision, because no one in the room is innocent of what comes next. Even dissent must move carefully once oath binds the assembly. That last detail is where Enki becomes indispensable to the source's theory. He does not openly overturn the council. He works around it. Through a wall. Through indirection. Through technical cunning. He does what administrators often do when a rule cannot be broken head-on, but can still be bent through interpretation. He speaks not directly to the human, but to the reed wall of the house. House. Wall. Listen. The language is magnificent because it is both legal and intimate. He obeys the letter enough to preserve his position, while violating the spirit enough to preserve life. That is not the action of a whimsical trickster only. It is the action of someone who has already decided that continuity matters more than total obedience to the collapse policy. And so, Atrahasis, or the flood survivor in the broader tradition, receives instructions. Not grand prophecy. Technical instruction. Build. Seal. Measure. Prepare. Bring family. Bring living seed. Bring what must survive the break. The source leans into that practical detail because it matches everything that has come before. Archive transfers. Household instruction. Temple adaptation. Crisis time in the King List. Now, survival specifications in the flood narrative itself. The world may be failing, but the response is still administrative, logistical, procedural. I have always found that mixture almost unbearably eerie. The end of a world described in instructions that sound like engineering. Imagine the night of preparation, the smell of cut timber, reed bundles stacked in shadow, pitch warmed and spread, hands working quickly but not wildly, a household not fully understanding the scale of what is coming, yet feeling enough urgency in the voice of instruction to obey. Water somewhere beyond the city, breathing in its channels as if it already knows something the people do not. The source wants us to feel that intimacy, not because it denies catastrophe, but because it relocates catastrophe inside procedure. The flood is coming, yes. But first there are dimensions, compartments, seals, stored provisions, chosen survivors, continuity packages for a world that will not be allowed to remain as it is. Then the flood comes. Here, the source is especially careful, and wisely so. It does not make the scene graphic. It makes it structural. Boundaries break. Waters cross where they should not cross. The world loses its partitions. Sound becomes overwhelming. The systems that once held field apart from canal, city apart from marsh, human order apart from deep water, all fail at once. The catastrophe is terrifying precisely because it is not random splash and thunder. It is total boundary failure. And in one of the source's most haunting readings, even the gods are afraid. This is crucial. In the old text, they cower. They gather like frightened dogs. They regret. They hunger for offerings afterward because the human ritual economy has been interrupted. Those details make little sense if the gods are enjoying effortless omnipotence. They make perfect sense if the flood is a threshold event larger than any one party fully controls once released. The assembly authorizes collapse. Then, collapse becomes real. And reality is always less obedient than policy. That is a devastating thought. A system can vote for an emergency measure and still be horrified by what the measure actually does. The source treats that horror as evidence that the flood was not simply divine anger wearing weather, but the terminal symptom of a problem already too large. Once triggered, the process exceeds comfort. The gods survive. The chosen humans survive. But the old inhabited world does not. Then come the post-flood regulations. This part is easy to hurry past, but the source does not hurry. Limits are introduced. Fertility adjusted. Social restrictions implied or formalized in later tradition, not because the gods have suddenly become moral philosophers, but because they are trying to prevent the system from reaching the same threshold again. After catastrophe, administration returns in altered form, reduced, cautious, more distant. That distance matters. The source argues that the flood does not restore the old world. It ends it. What comes after is a damaged continuity. Humans remain. Cities return. Kingship resumes on smaller scales. Ritual continues, but the divine presence is no longer the same. Mere residence gives way to selective intervention. Temple household becomes less like active occupancy and more like managed memory. And if that is right, Atrahasis becomes the hinge of the whole theory. Not the first moment of divine cruelty, but the official decision point where the Anunnaki, or at least the governing assembly among them, accept that the old operating model cannot continue. Enlil embodies the severe line. Enki embodies salvage. The flood becomes the act that closes one age and opens a thinner, poorer, more distant relationship between gods and world. You know that feeling when a household survives a terrible illness, or a fire, or a financial collapse, and from the outside it still looks like the same household, but everyone inside knows the life before and the life after are not the same life. That is how the source wants the flood to feel. Not beginning. Division. The old age where the gods could still inhabit and govern in one way. The later age where they remain real, but further off, more guarded, more selective, more administrative from a distance. And all the little records we have already followed begin to align around that pivot. The archive tablet with sacred objects transferred. Eridu adapting under stress. The King List measuring impossible durations before normalization. Shuruppak preserving household continuity advice. And now Atrahasis giving us the meeting where final reduction is chosen, yet cleverly resisted just enough to keep human continuity alive. By the time the source reaches this point, the title question has almost answered itself. What were the Anunnaki escaping before the Sumerian gods left Earth? They were escaping a world that had become unmanageable under the old terms. A world whose labor systems, environmental boundaries, and governing balance had stretched too far. A world in which lesser remedies failed, and where even the final remedy frightened those who approved it. That does not make the theory proven in every detail. It remains interpretive. Some scholars would push back strongly and fairly against reading the whole Mesopotamian archive through one evacuation frame. But as a narrative synthesis, it is powerful because it keeps finding the same emotional signature across very different texts. Strain, preservation, procedure, retreat. So stay in the assembly chamber a little longer. Hear no triumphant music. Hear the hush after the oath. Hear the reed wall listening in the dark. Hear tools gathering for construction. Hear water waiting beyond the limits men thought permanent. And above all, hear the terrible calm of beings who have realized that saving everything is no longer an available option. The next movement of the story will follow what remains after that decision. Cities mourning, gods withdrawing formally before destruction, underworld journeys testing whether any alternate refuge exists, empty temples, archives that outlast presence. The flood may be the breaking point, but the silence afterward is where the full meaning of divine departure becomes unmistakable. After the flood decision, the source does not rush toward comfort. It moves into mourning. That is exactly the right move, because if a world has been judged unmanageable, if the old divine administration has withdrawn from direct residence, if cities continue after catastrophe, but no longer under the same nearness of sacred occupancy, then the first thing human memory will preserve is not triumph. It will preserve abandonment, not the abstract kind, the domestic kind, the sort that settles into walls, courtyards, storage rooms, thresholds, and the daily sound of ritual continuing after the one for whom the ritual was arranged has gone quiet. This is where the city laments become so important to the source's argument. On the surface, they are exactly what scholars usually call them: lamentations over ruined cities, destroyed temples, displaced populations, sacred centers emptied by war, collapse, or divine judgment. But the source asks us to hear something more specific in their repeated pattern. Again and again, a city is not destroyed first and only later mourned. Again and again, the text insists that the goddess or god leaves first, or is taken away first, or formally withdraws before the devastation becomes complete. That sequence matters. If the divine resident departs before the city falls, then the destruction is not simply an event. It is an after effect. The city does not lose its god because it was ruined. It is ruined because the god is no longer there to maintain it in the old way. That is a subtle difference. But once you hear it, the laments stop sounding like poetic piety and start sounding like institutional memory. Presence withdrawn, protection withdrawn, household left open to forces it once could survive. The source slows over this pattern with good reason. Uruk. Sumerian centers remembered through tears and formal sorrow. The lament voice often sounds almost unbearably personal. The city is addressed as a living thing. The temple is spoken of as a house emptied against its will. The goddess is imagined grieving, yet going. The people remain below, but the divine resident is no longer at home among them in the same way. If you were standing with me in one of those emptied courts after the rites had stopped for the night, you would not need much imagination to feel what the texts are preserving. Bowls remain. Floors remain. Door frames remain. The address still exists. The presence has thinned beyond touch. I have always found that sequence more unsettling than open destruction. A building can be repaired after fire. A wall can be raised again after impact. But a house that has been deliberately left by the one it was built around becomes difficult to understand. The arrangements are still there, yet they no longer answer to life in the same way. So let us enter that atmosphere slowly. A temple court at dusk. The light is turning from ochre to gray. The stone or mud brick still holds a little of the day's warmth, but the air is cooling. A lamp has been lit somewhere in an inner chamber because habit outlives certainty. A priest moves quietly through the familiar route. The offering stand is where it has always been. A curtain stirs. A storage jar waits in shadow. Dust has begun gathering in places where once there would have been more traffic, more hands, more urgency. Nothing dramatic has happened in this single moment. That is exactly the point. Divine absence, in the source's telling, often arrives before obvious ruin. The temple still functions enough to prove that something is wrong. The city laments, preserve that feeling in language thick with sorrow. The goddess cries for her city, but she is also no longer in it. The house is named. The people are named. The sacred furniture is named. Yet the text turns insistently toward departure. The god leaves. The city follows into vulnerability. This is one of the strongest emotional confirmations of the source's whole thesis. The Anunnaki did not vanish from Earth as a theatrical single act. They withdrew from specific administrative residences, and the cities tied to those residences remembered the withdrawal as the true beginning of catastrophe. That is why the laments sound so administrative even inside their grief. Doors are left. Rituals interrupted. Sacred roots broken. Offerings no longer accepted in the old way. The city continues to exist physically for a while, but its covenantal occupancy has been altered. It is rather like a household where the owner has already moved out, but the servants continue trying to keep the rooms in order because no one has yet found a way to live without the routine. You know that feeling when people continue setting the table for a while after a death? Not because they truly expect the missing person to sit down, but because the act itself postpones the final admission. The laments carry that same human reflex, but on a civic scale. And that civic scale matters, because the source is not merely making an emotional argument. It is making a structural one. If cities in Mesopotamian tradition are divine households, then city lament is not only patriotic grief, it is the language of failed residents. A house losing its resident. A system losing its local administrator. A sacred node losing direct occupancy while the outward frame still stands. The source uses this to reinforce the long withdrawal model. The flood did not solve things by restoring the old order. It ended the old order. What follows is a world where divine presence becomes more selective, more distant, more conditional. The laments remember this through sequence. Departure, then ruin. Departure, then empty ritual. Departure, then people trying to survive in a place that still knows its God's name but no longer knows that God's nearness. There is a quality of formal mourning in these texts that feels almost legal. Repeated lines, repeated images, repeated naming of temple and city. It is as though memory itself is performing inventory. One last time, before admitting the system cannot be reassembled as before. In that sense, the laments belong beautifully beside the archive tablet from the beginning. Both are preserving a departure. One does it in procedural shorthand. The other does it in tears. And then the source introduces another haunting possibility. What if some later mythic journeys preserve not only grief, but reconnaissance? This is where Inanna enters. Her descent to the underworld is one of the most famous Mesopotamian narratives, and like all famous ancient narratives, it risks becoming too smooth in retelling. Many readers come to it expecting symbolism about fertility, death, power, and return. Those layers are real and important, but the source asks whether the descent can also be read through the lens of failed refuge, not ordinary underworld tourism, if such a thing existed, but a test of another domain, a movement downward to see whether any alternate administrative zone exists beyond the failing surface world. That reading is interpretive, certainly. Some scholars would resist it, and fairly. But as a narrative continuation of the source's thesis, it is remarkably effective. Because once the upper world has become unstable, once city residents has become vulnerable, once the flood has already revealed systemic boundary failure, the question arises naturally. Where else is there to go? Inanna descends through gates. At each gate, something is stripped away. Crown, jewels, rod, garments, power markers surrendered step by step. The old text is ritual, symbolic, severe. The source lingers on the stripping because it changes the descent from triumph into test. By the time she reaches the depths, she has been reduced from the fully equipped authority of upper world residents to something far more exposed. If this is a reconnaissance narrative in even partial form, then the message becomes chillingly clear. Another domain exists. Yes, but it is not available as simple refuge. Let us slow that descent. A gate in dimness. A guardian speaking the required formula. A piece of authority removed. Another gate. Another surrender. Ornaments that once signaled sovereignty no longer permitted to pass. The air cooler with each stage. The light thinning. The silence becoming less like hush and more like pressure. I think this is why the source places the underworld after the city laments and not before. Because by then the listener already understands the problem. The surface residences are failing. The temple households are thinning. The gods are withdrawing from cities before cities fall. So when a great goddess descends and finds not safety but a domain of strict reduction and deathly stasis, the narrative acquires new force. The lower realm may exist, but it does not offer continuity for the kind of administrative life the upper world once held. That matters because failed refuge is a very different mythic mood from dramatic conquest. In the old story, Inanna does not simply conquer and return unchanged. She is halted, judged, stripped, killed, or suspended in a death-like stillness depending on translation. Recovery requires intervention and substitution. The underworld cannot simply host upper world authority without cost. If the source is even partly right, then the lesson becomes stark. The deeper domain is not where governance can comfortably relocate, and so the world above remains the only world worth preserving, even while it becomes harder to preserve. Now return with that thought to the emptying cities. The temple doors still stand. The goddess has departed. The city remembers and mourns. The underworld offers no easy relocation. The flood has already shown what total boundary failure looks like. The King List has preserved exhausted spans of management. The practical instructions of Shuruppak have taught households how to carry forward fragments of order. One by one, the texts begin sounding less like separate religious artifacts and more like documents from different floors of the same collapsing institution. There is a strange comfort in that coherence, though it is dark comfort, because once the pattern becomes visible, the silence of the later temples stops being random. The gods have not simply become lazy or absent-minded. They have become remote because the terms of old residence no longer hold. The source also returns, quietly but importantly, to Enki and the waters. Eridu was his city. The Apsu was his domain. If even the water god sphere is unstable, if foundations shift and sacred occupancy thins there first, then the whole ecology of divine administration is compromised. Water, which should sustain, becomes ambiguous. It is the source of life, ritual purity, irrigation, transport, and wisdom. It is also the medium of collapse, saturation, salinization, and flood. That duality runs beneath the whole theory like a current. The thing that made civilization possible becomes the thing through which civilization is lost. You can hear that duality in the laments too. Tears, rivers, flooded memory, emptied house. The language itself behaves like water, gathering, repeating, wearing down certainty by soft persistence rather than impact. By now, the listener should feel that we have reached the emotional heart of the story. Not the loudest moment, but the deepest one. A civilization that remembered its gods, not mainly through one spectacular ending, but through a long sequence of withdrawals, emptied residences, preserved instructions, shrinking durations, and one terrible realization. The gods were no longer here in the way they had once been here. And then, almost gently, the source begins to narrow the world again. Back from city-wide lament to archive shelf. Back from divine descent to clay tablet. Back from public catastrophe to preserved objects. This narrowing is wise, because big theories only remain haunting if they can still fit inside a hand. The source wants us to end, not in abstraction, but in material memory. A label on a museum tray, a wedge impression in fired clay, a transfer note that once sounded ordinary and now sounds like a final administrative whisper from a world learning to evacuate itself. So stay for a moment in the aftersound of the laments. Hear a city crying because its goddess has gone. Hear a priest whispering through rites that have become more memorial than inhabited. Hear the low, cold stillness of the underworld, where even great authority must surrender its ornaments. Hear the reed rustle at the marsh edge near Eridu, where foundations once promised permanence and later learned humility. Hear the archive boxes closing softly in a museum far away, while the tablets inside keep repeating the same emotional shape in different languages. Preserve, transfer, withdraw, lament, continue if possible. Because the source's final claim is not that the Anunnaki hated Earth and abandoned it carelessly. It is that they preserved what they could not continue to inhabit fully. They left records. They left procedures. They left warnings. They left household discipline, technical survival, reduced post-flood continuity, and a memory structure strong enough that thousands of years later one can still hear, beneath all the mythic language, the sound of a system backing away from a world it could no longer govern without unacceptable loss. And once you hear that, the final question is no longer whether the gods left. The final question becomes, what exactly was being saved in the leaving? That is what the last movement must answer, not by adding more spectacle, by returning to the tablets, by returning to the small administrative voices that outlived every temple wall, by letting the whole story close where it began, in low light, in dust, in clay, with the eerie dignity of a record that may have survived because someone knew the house was closing. In the end, the source does not ask us to choose between myth and history as if one must destroy the other. It asks for a quieter kind of attention, the kind you give to a room after everyone has left it, the kind you give to a document that sounds too calm for the event it may be recording. The kind you give to old clay when you suspect the most frightening thing it preserves is not fantasy, but procedure. So we return to the archive, back to the shelves, back to the subdued light, back to the tray holding a small reddish-brown tablet whose wedge marks have lasted longer than any palace or canal system that once depended on them. By now, the object does not feel the way it did at the beginning. At first, it looked like an odd administrative curiosity. Now, it feels like the smallest surviving edge of a much wider silence. I have always loved that about archives. They do not shout. They wait. A sword can impress you quickly. A monument can make you feel small. But a tablet with transfer language, preserved among other tablets with inventory language, lament language, King List language, wisdom language, and flood language, does something subtler. It asks whether the same emotional signature is passing through all of them. Strain, preservation, withdrawal, continuity reduced to what can be carried. The source's final synthesis is daring, but it is not careless. It does not claim that every scholar agrees. It does not pretend that each tablet offers a simple, literal statement of evacuation. It builds instead through mood, sequence, and repeated structural features. Sacred centers showing fatigue. Kingship remembered in impossible durations before shrinking back to human scale. Household wisdom behaving like continuity training. A divine assembly reaching triage. Gods withdrawing from cities before cities fall. A descent narrative that suggests no comfortable refuge elsewhere. Administrative notes, preserving sacred transfers. All of it together begins to sound like one long civilizational memory of managed retreat. Managed retreat. That phrase may be the coldest one in the entire theory, because it implies intention without triumph. It implies intelligence under pressure. It implies a decision not to save everything because everything can no longer be saved. A flood in that frame is no longer the dramatic beginning of sacred history. It is the terminal symptom of a world whose supporting structure has already been failing for a very long time. And if that is even partly right, the old question changes. What were the Anunnaki escaping before the Sumerian gods left Earth? They were escaping a system they could no longer hold in its previous form. They were escaping administrative exhaustion written into temple walls, regnal spans, and lament formulas. They were escaping a world where boundaries, ecological, social, cosmic, had become unstable enough that continued residence meant unacceptable exposure. They were escaping not from irrelevance, but from overextension. That last thought is one I keep returning to. Overextension. The Source never needs spaceships or metallic costumes to make its version of the Anunnaki unsettling. It only needs them to feel like powerful stewards facing a world larger and less stable than their original settlement model had allowed for. Once you grant that possibility, the whole Mesopotamian archive becomes emotionally coherent in a new way. The gods do not disappear because they were never real within the text's worldview. They become distant because proximity itself has become costly. You know that feeling when a family stops gathering in the old house? Not because the house means nothing, but because the plumbing fails. The ground shifts. The roof leaks. And the illnesses begin to accumulate. At first they patch. Then they repair. Then they keep one room warm. Then they move valuables out. Then they visit on special days. Finally, someone locks the door and says it with tears, but also with practicality. We cannot live here now. The Source reads Sumerian divine history with that exact sadness. And there is something almost merciful in the preservation. Because they do preserve. That is the part too many dramatic retellings miss. If the Source is right, the Anunnaki did not erase everything and vanish in pure indifference. The records imply transfer. The wisdom texts imply training. The flood survivor receives technical instruction. Post-flood order is reduced, but not annihilated. The city laments preserve memory in language that still knows who once lived there. Even the impossibly long rains preserve a sense of duration, of burden carried before final break. The old system retreats, yes, but it leaves maps in damaged form. Those maps are not easy to read. They are broken across museums, translations, traditions, damaged signs, uncertain contexts, and later copies. Some scholars resist reading them as a unified pattern, and again, that resistance deserves respect. The Source is interpretive, not final. Yet, interpretation matters when the archive itself refuses to become simple. Sometimes the most faithful way to honor a difficult archive is not to flatten it into certainty, but to follow the emotional logic that keeps recurring across its fragments. And the emotional logic here is very hard to ignore. A first city that feels like a divine residence, then less so. A king list that sounds less like fantasy and more like exhausted chronology. A father teaching a son how to walk carefully in a world that may not stay orderly. A council authorizing catastrophe because lesser corrections failed. A God of wisdom preserving continuity through indirection. Cities mourning because their divine inhabitants have already gone. A descent proving that deeper realms offer no easy substitute. Archives preserving the calm language of things moved before absence becomes total. That is not random mythic noise. It is a pattern, perhaps not a universally accepted pattern, perhaps not provable in every link, but unmistakably a pattern. So let us sit beside it without forcing it. The candles are lower now. The room is quieter. The museum hush has returned in the mind. The clay tablet rests under the same soft light where we first found it. And because we have walked through Eridu, the King List, Shuruppak, Atrahasis, the Laments, and the underworld, the little object now carries more weight than before. It has become what the best artifacts always become when properly contextualized. Not a relic, a voice. Not a loud voice, a procedural voice. A voice saying the sacred things were counted. A voice saying the necessary texts were moved. A voice saying departure was organized. A voice surviving because someone, human, divine, institutional, perhaps all three at once, understood that continuity would depend on what could still be carried after presence withdrew. This is why the final mood of the story is not panic. It is stillness. The Anunnaki, in the source's reading, were not fleeing in wild disorder. They were withdrawing with terrible discipline. That is more frightening than chaos in some ways. Chaos, at least, suggests no one knew what was happening. Managed retreat suggests they knew enough to begin leaving, while the world below may still have felt mostly ordinary. Imagine that for a moment. A priest still trimming a lamp in a temple whose deepest resident authority is already thinning. A scribe copying wisdom instructions while the larger civic guarantees are quietly failing. A father telling a son to mind the wet bank, the unreliable road, the dangerous looseness of speech. A ruler's name being placed inside a chronology already too long for comfort. A goddess being mourned in a city she has effectively left. A survivor sealing a vessel while the council above has already accepted the unthinkable. A little clay note recording sacred transfer, while most people still have no language for evacuation. That is the darkest elegance of the whole theory. The end did not begin when the waters rose. It began when maintenance turned into preservation. And so the source leaves us with a different image of the ancient world. Not one of careless myth-makers inventing grand destruction for entertainment. Not one of all-powerful gods acting without limit. But one of civilizations and divinities entangled in systems, institutions, ecologies, and inherited burdens, all of them pressing toward a point where the old form of nearness could no longer hold. Maybe that is why these stories still calm and disturb at the same time. They are very old, but they understand a very modern fear. Not sudden apocalypse only. System fatigue. Thresholds crossed quietly. Procedures continuing after conviction has already failed. Archives left behind because someone knew the center would not hold forever. So let the tablet rest where it is. Let the shelves remain in shadow. Let Eridu sink gently back under wind and dust. Let the prism keep its impossible years. Let the father in Shuruppak finish his quiet instruction. Let Enki's warning pass through the wall. Let the city laments continue their sorrow in low formal lines. Let Inanna return from below, having learned that not every depth is refuge. Let the flood remain not the first act, but the last visible wave of a much older crisis. And if, after all this, you ask once more what the Anunnaki were escaping before the Sumerian gods left Earth, the answer the source gives is both stranger and sadder than simple punishment. They were escaping collapse that had already entered the foundations. They were escaping the failure of maintained order. They were escaping a world whose sacred households had become too costly to inhabit directly. They were escaping by preserving what could survive them. That is why the smallest records matter most. Because when empires fall and gods withdraw, what remains is often not the spectacle. It is the note left on clay, the item counted, the room remembered, the instruction preserved, the absence managed, the silence catalogued. There is one last feeling the source leaves behind, and I think it is worth holding for a moment before the room goes fully quiet. The feeling is not that of being told a secret in excitement. It is the feeling of coming upon evidence that has been patient for far longer than any listener deserves. Clay does not rush. Dust does not rush. Archives do not beg to be believed. They simply remain. And because they remain, later minds get one more chance to notice that the ancient world may have recorded its own unraveling with far more care than we usually grant it. So imagine a final pass through the vault. A shelf label. A tray edge. A tablet resting exactly where the conservator left it. A low hum from climate control. No priest now. No scribe. No king. No lament singer. Only the object, and the strange humility of reading something old enough to know that spectacle passes faster than administration. And now the archive closes again. The lights dim. The clay cools in the dark. The last administrative whisper settles into stillness. And all that remains is the feeling that somewhere in the oldest libraries of Earth, the end of one world was recorded not as a scream, but as a careful departure. Good night,